Today, we are looking at a glimpse of education's history. We are going to discuss a few of the laws and cases of our educational history that have brought us to our progress that we have made today. The laws and cases go from issues such as racial segregation, language issues, issues as far as funding and low income students, and so forth. Our first case that we will be looking at is the Meyer versus Nebraska case of 1923. This was a court case that challenged the 1919 Nebraska Act. The 1919 Nebraska Act restricted the use of resources of another language to be used as a source of learning in a classroom. The main issue from this case was when a teacher tried teaching students Bible stories that were written in German. There was a lot of controversy and issues that were sparked from that. The court case challenged the Nebraska Act by stating that the law violates the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The case resulted in banning the Nebraska Act and allowing students to be taught using a foreign language, as the court ruled that they agreed with the fact that it was in violation of the 14th Amendment. Our next clause that we will be looking at is the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954. This case involved a young African American student who was denied access to an all-white school during the 1950s. The student's mother, Linda Brown, was very unhappy with this, of course, and claimed that even though there's this separate but equal, it really wasn't equal. And she claimed that this violated the segregation laws and violated the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ended up agreeing with Ms. Brown and ended up ruling that separate but equal was unfair and ended up being outlawed. So that was a big success for our educational victories. Our next act is the National Defense Education Act of 1958. Due to this time period restricting like instructions read in a foreign language and so forth, a lot of people responded to Sputnik being launched as like a negative thing, as it showed Soviets' acceleration in the space race and the US being behind. So they thought in order to catch up in the space race and surpass the Soviets, it was only reasonable to support instruction written or taught in a foreign language. So that act was passed by Congress in 1958. This also allowed for over billions of dollars to be donated for educational purposes and experiments. Our next act is the Civil Rights Act, which includes Title VI of 1964. This is one of the most crucial acts of all time for not only our educational history, but our history as a whole. And of course, this act bans discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. This also includes the banning of racial segregation in schools. The Title VI Act is part of the Civil Rights Act, and this also prohibits discrimination in any program that is federally funded. Since all public schools are federally funded, this includes racial segregation to be terminated in public schools as well. The Title VI Act also gave Hispanic students the opportunity for a bilingual education. Our next act is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This was passed during President Johnson's war on poverty, where he really tried tackling issues of poverty and low-income families throughout the U.S. This act addresses the academic needs of students who came from low-income families. It really helped with providing an equal education for low-income students compared to students of a more middle class or higher class um, school, because it provided funds to provide qualified teachers and like professional materials, resources for learning, and resources for parents to improve their participation rates in order to give these students a better educational experience and outcome. Our next act is the Bilingual Education Act, which includes Title VII of the 1968. This act is known as Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The purpose of this was to provide federal funding to school districts to use towards establishing bilingual education programs. This act is very important because it was the first federal law to address the unique needs of students with limited English proficiency and really focus on what they need to have in the classroom to develop their English skills. Our next case is the Lau versus Nichols case of 1970. This case was brought to attention when several students of Chinese descent were brought into schools not being able to speak any English, yet all classes were taught in English and there were no supplemental English classes or instruction for them to use as like an aid or support to help them try to learn English. It was claimed to have been a violation of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act because it prevented students from participating in public educational opportunities. There was a lot of disagreement with the courts at first, ruling that it wasn't in violation and that it was completely fair, but eventually, after lots of fighting and efforts, it was finally agreed that it was a violation to lack the supplemental instruction, then requiring schools to have this for students who are not English proficient learners. Next, we have the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974. This act declares that no person should be denied any educational opportunities based on their race, color, sex, and national origin by any state. If any of these educational opportunities are denied for any reason based on these aspects, then the educational agency must take an appropriate action to overcome these barriers that have prevented equal participation of the students and the instructional programs provided. Next, we have the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. This is basically a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 with a few additions. It includes state standardized testing for grades 3 through 8 and also requires students to take it once in high school. The students are expected to meet or exceed the standards of the state. The purpose of this act is to really get rid of the student achievement gaps and try to present all children with a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to get a good education. So it really focuses on making sure all students are on the correct level before moving up a grade and making sure everyone's on the same pace as everyone else, and if not, then closing those achievement gaps with extra help. Our last act is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which was set during the Obama administration, and it provided over $44 billion in motivational funding for education. This act included a program called Race to the Top, which created over $4 billion in competitive grants for states to kind of motivate them to begin education reform efforts. By 2012, nearly half of the states had grants from the Race to the Top programs, which was a big turnout. And lastly, we have our works cited of all of the sources that were used in the making of this presentation. Thank you.